The rough odds of a damaging, like bad earthquake, maybe not the worst, but bad earthquake happening around here in the next 50 years might be roughly 1 in 3.
Yeah, well, if we'd known, we would have rethought coming out here.
It really is hard to convince a lot of people of something that hasn't happened.
In today's episode, we're going to talk to two people about one of the most unnerving aspects of living on the West Coast, the big one. The big one is an earthquake that has the potential to change the landscape of Victoria forever. But most people don't really think about it in their day-to-day lives. So we talked to Gregor Craigie, the author of On Borrowed Time, North America's Next Big Quake, about his book, about the big one, and about what people can do.
Here with Island Sound and Story, talking to Gregor Craigie, who you may know as the host of CBC's On the Island, and who's also an author. And one of the books that you've written is called On Borrowed Time, and it's about not only here, the big one, but across North America, the risk of a big quake. How did you get onto the topic for the book in the first place?
I think it was when I first moved here, my first iteration as a CBC journalist in Victoria. I was actually a legislative reporter for CBC Television, and I worked in the BC legislature, the magnificent old dome, and I was up on the third floor, I think it was, in the legislative press gallery, and I loved the building. But then one day when I was down in the basement in the radio legislative press gallery, where there's no windows and the walls are, I don't know, they're about 2 feet thick of old granite. One of the legislative reporters made some dark humor joke about it's a great place to work until the big one hits. And then we got into this conversation. They all were aware that the building had been assessed as being seismically vulnerable. In other words, it could all come crashing down in a big earthquake. It should be noted that a medium earthquake should be fine for the legislature. It's actually pretty robust. But because you've got stones stacked on stones with just mortar in between, if it's a really big earthquake, it could come crashing down. And so I thought, well, hang on a second. Why is everybody so blasé about this? And as I spent a year and a half there at the legislature, I started to realize, okay, there's reasons for that because it's not easy to fix. But then I became more and more aware of all the many buildings around Victoria and Vancouver and Nanaimo and on that are vulnerable. And then I moved away to the Kootenays for a year for a different assignment. And when I came back, my wife and I came with a new baby. And one day I was in Crystal Pool in Victoria in the old paddling pool with my 6-month-old. And I was looking up at the roof, the giant span above Crystal Pool, and I had just read at work that morning a seismic assessment done for the city of Victoria that had said that that building would collapse as well. And I thought, we've got to do something about this. But how do you decide what to do? How quickly? You can't tear everything down and rebuild it right away. So that was kind of the start of a long fascination. And about 10 years later, after doing countless interviews on the subject and thinking about it and worrying about it and trying to fix my own home, I finally decided to write a book.
And so it was this feeling of you're going around the city and different buildings that you're in, you're starting to have this radar of, is this safe? What if it hit right now?
Yeah.
Would I live? Would my children live?
Absolutely. And in fact, it was the kind of thing that after a while I started to have to stop myself. I remember being in an anniversary dinner in old Victoria downtown in a lovely old restaurant in a brick building. And I was just about to point this out to my wife, and I thought, maybe I better not. And actually, I remember talking to an engineer about that afterwards, a seismic engineer who works in it. And I said, do you ever have moments like that? I described the situation in the restaurant. And he said, yes, but I've learned to differentiate the risk of something that may or may not happen in our lifetime happening in the next hour is a lot less than the
Quite
risk
small.
of it. Yeah, very small. Whereas, if it's your house and you're going to spend the next 20 or 30 years there, if you're lucky, maybe 40 years, that's a much bigger risk. Or if it's your school and your neighborhood school, there's always going to be kids in there 10 months of the year. Well, that's a different risk. So it's a good way to start thinking about it, of what you should worry about and maybe don't need to worry about too much.
Yeah, well, I'll ask you in a little bit about some of these questions of how we approach risk. But first off, can you describe the big one a little more? We all have a casual understanding. It's a big tsunami. It's going to hit eventually. Can you describe why it happens, what it looks like, and what the prognostication or the time frame looks like for it?
When people talk about the big one on Vancouver Island in Vancouver, we usually mean a giant megathrust subduction earthquake off
Mhm.
the west coast of Vancouver Island, possibly going as far as from the northern tip of Vancouver Island all the way down to northern California.
Mhm.
That's the Cascadia megathrust earthquake. People talk about it, and it could be the world's largest earthquake, a magnitude 9 earthquake, which is about as big as the 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan or the 2004 Sumatra earthquake in the Indian Ocean. And these are world-changing earthquakes
Mhm.
that have led to tens or even hundreds of thousands of deaths, and very sobering. And those happen. We know now, scientists know that they happen in this part of the world every about 200 to 900 years. So that's a huge window, of course.
Mhm.
And we're now 326 years in since the last one. So we're in the window, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen before you and I die. I mean, it could happen 10 seconds after this. We're finished talking here today, or maybe it'll happen 300 years from today. But when we talk about the big one, and that will cause the tsunami, that's the one you talk about as well. But when we talk about a big one, there's two other types here. There is one called a crustal earthquake, which actually could be on a global scale smaller. So it could be up closer to the surface. It could happen on a fault line much closer to a place like Victoria. And even though it would only be, say, a magnitude 7 or 6.5 instead of a magnitude 9, it could actually be as damaging, maybe even more damaging to a place like Victoria. For instance, here I go with the cheery thoughts, but it could bring a building like we're talking in today down, where maybe that offshore magnitude 9 might not, because the shaking would be longer and of a different amplitude than a really rough 30 or 60-second shake that might shake Victoria. So that's a crustal earthquake, a smaller one, but just devastating if it's right next to a city. And then there are these intraslab deep earthquakes that don't happen all over the world, but they seem to happen around the Puget Sound area. And those, like the one we had in 2000 in Olympia, Washington, and those can cause a lot of damage as well. So when you add it all up, it's really hard to say when the next one will happen. I mean, scientists I've talked to, they bristle, they almost flinch sometimes when you say, "Yeah, but what are the odds?" And they say, "But no, it's not like that." One scientist I talked to, a seismologist, said any chimp can do that.
Yeah.
I said, but people want to know the numbers. Yeah, fine. So some I've talked to have said roughly, and they're really hesitant to do this, but the rough odds of a damaging, like bad earthquake, maybe not the worst, but bad earthquake happening around here in the next 50 years might be roughly 1 in 3.
But
So
they're
that's a
reluctant to frame it in
they
those
they
terms
are.
of probability, of coin flips.
Yeah,
That
totally.
doesn't properly describe how they approach the projection?
Yeah, because I mean, the future is all they can do is base it on past events. And usually, I mean, so most earthquakes happen along fault lines, or the dividing line, or the friction point between different tectonic plates. And geologists are able, through a number of means, to see when they've happened in the past. And so, for instance, if you look at the Cascadia subduction zone, they can see the reason they can estimate 200 to 900 years is because they can see that's how often it's happened in the past, I think 10 or 11,000 years
Mm.
since the last ice age. So things change, and for all they know, something is about to change, and it could happen sooner or later. So they're being cautious. They're also recognizing there's a huge window of error. If something happens every 2 to 900 years, how can you say with any specificity? I mean, maybe they just haven't calculated the interval that might be 1,500 years, or
Mm.
whatever, or 327. So they're reticent to do that. Also, because there's some examples, and I read about this in the book, places like in Italy, scientists were taken to court for saying, making specific points, or well, not really scientists, but the head of an agency in Italy that was supposed to tackle seismic preparedness. He had tried to assure, in talking publicly, people in a seismic prone area of Italy that a major earthquake wasn't imminent, and in fact, it encouraged prosecutors in Italy, said a number of people to go back into their homes, and then there was a big quake and a lot of people died when they would have actually been sleeping outside in tents, as was a centuries-old tradition in that part of Italy. And it should be noted, the scientists didn't say that. They were very careful, but the head of the agency did say this. And so every scientist I've met is understandably very careful about this. It's a difficult risk. It's basically impossible to be precise about it. So they don't want to make it seem like it's simpler and we know more than we do. But when the future is wide open, so to speak.
But we come here in some of what you're saying to the question of human behavior, of how do your cities behave, how do your governments behave, how do you and your neighbors behave? What is it like to try and figure out how people will approach this risk, or how did you find in the book that people tend to approach this risk?
I think there's a lot of different approaches, and that's one of the things that's fascinating to me. Is it's a study in psychology as much as earth science, because people fundamentally treat risk differently depending on their personality or maybe their situation in life. Maybe you have young kids. That's when I was at my most on guard for this. And as my kids have become older and more independent, I have to admit I've relaxed a bit. I was told by one person who'd lived here for years, if you're going to worry about earthquakes, you should just leave Victoria. And I thought, maybe they're right. Or is that really the right attitude? Should we are the two choices do nothing or leave? There's got to be somewhere in the middle, and that's the huge gray area of how much do you do. I have to say I like the BC government's approach, and this spans both NDP and Liberals. They've kept it going through a couple of governments, well, several governments, at fixing our schools, where they're way past deadline, because the truth is it's taken a lot longer than they thought, but they're slowly but surely replacing some schools, strengthening others. And I think what they basically did in the end, after years of studying this and a bit of panic on behalf of parents like me, they finally said, well, look, we just can't do this all at once. We don't have enough construction workers, let alone money. It's not feasible. But let's assess hundreds of schools. We'll rank them by greatest need, and then we'll slowly, methodically, over the years, take the time to fix them. And they're getting there. They're probably a little more than halfway through the list. Of course, if your child goes to a school that
hasn't got there yet,
yeah, you don't think it's fast enough, and you're probably right. And in the end, if they're all done before the next earthquake happens, then it seems like the prudent approach. And if the earthquake happens beforehand and any schools collapse, then maybe it was too slow. But the point is, they're trying somewhere for that middle ground between panic and complete complacency. I think, though, a lot of us, like myself included, and private apartment building owners or other owners of various buildings and infrastructure, are more complacent. It feels like, I think a lot of times people, for understandable reasons, have more things going on and they just can't or don't get to it.
I think in the book you talked about Mississippi, a disaster there where they were struggling with trying to get people to invest in preventing future ones. And there was a line to the effect of, it's hard to get people to pay for something they haven't yet experienced, when, of course, experiencing it would be disastrous. Is that something that comes into play here? And does that approach to the big one, in this case, speak to a broader difficulty with tackling climate-related events in the future?
Yeah, I think there's real similarities between climate readiness and earthquakes, for all the obvious differences. In our day-to-day lives, for the most part, we can get about things without feeling directly affected by climate change. And I know you could argue that in many ways. Of course, there was the heat dome a few years ago. There are many other things. There are fires and so on. I'm not saying that climate change isn't already affecting us, but we can sort of get by on a day-to-day basis. And it's probably the more so if you live in a city where there hasn't been a deadly earthquake in living memory. Like Victoria, I mean, we've had shakers. There was a big one on Vancouver Island in the 1940s, which happened on a Sunday morning. So even though there was significant damage to an elementary school in Courtenay, nobody was killed. So yeah, the point that if you haven't lived through something is really significant. I mean, in the American Mississippi River Valley area, they had a huge series of earthquakes in 1812, I think it was. But of course, nobody can remember that. And so people there are already worried about tornadoes and flooding and financial what have you. So the office there that's supposed to get towns ready for this, it talks about people just scoffing all the time. Oh, yeah, you just want this is just big government or big insurance trying to scare us when there's nothing to worry about. I've never felt an earthquake in my life. Why would I get prepared for it? And so I think it's no secret that a place like Japan, where almost everybody has visceral memory or firsthand knowledge of the fear, understands this isn't theoretical. This isn't a concocted story to bilk me from my money. We need to get ready for this. So I think seeing and feeling is believing, and it really is hard to convince a lot of people of something that hasn't happened. I remember going through the Vic High before it was seismically retrofitted about 5 years ago, and the school district was trying to get public engagement from neighbors, students, alumni about whether the building should be torn down completely and replaced with a new building that was seismically sound, or whether it should be just retrofitted so they kept the heritage. And I heard from several old alumni members who said almost quote unquote, you know what, I was born in this city. I was raised here. And it stood, it'll be fine. I've never felt a death, a giant earthquake here. It'll be fine. And basically the logic of what they're saying is, well, it hasn't happened while I've been here, so therefore it won't happen. I mean, that's not what science tells us. It's going to happen. The only question is when.
Is there also for people personally a kind of sense of, well, I guess I'll die. If it happens, I'll take my chances, and if it arrives, I'll die and I'll have made the wrong bet. And if people do act that way, is there a risk of not engaging? They understand the risk is real. They understand that it could happen, but in a sense, they're opting out of planning for it. They're prepared to roll the dice. Is that something you see?
Definitely. And again, it depends on the personality, worldview, often economic circumstances. I think it's really understandable for a person who's barely scraping by and doesn't have much financial agency over their lives. You know, it's just a theoretical concept to say, well, maybe if your landlord, strengthened your apartment building. Well, I'm not saying they can do nothing, because they can do something. They can talk to them and get involved with community preparedness. But on the other hand, they don't have the financial means to fix the building. There was a really interesting study into this that compared 3 seismically vulnerable areas of the world: Seattle, I think it was Osaka, Japan anyway. I think it was Osaka, and Turkey, Izmir. All 3 communities around the world where they're vulnerable to really big, fatal earthquakes. And it was interesting. The academics noted a number of different attitudes, and broadly different, but they called it a sense of fatalism that was especially present in Turkey, even though people knew firsthand from deadly earthquakes. I mean, we've seen some since the study and before. People knew what was at stake, but many felt that because of what they thought was government corruption, and because of they lacked the financial means to fix buildings themselves, that it couldn't it couldn't be done. So a lot of people had what the authors called a fatalistic attitude. Well, what have you? I mean, that's the future. If God wills it, or if it's the future, or whatever your worldview, it's going to happen. So and I mean, in some ways, if you think about it from a point of view of not wanting to lead the most anxious life, there's a certain wisdom to some extent in not worrying about things that you can't control. Whereas others, the Japanese in general trusted the authorities, the government, to look after it, whereas the Americans had the most confidence that they would be able to, through their own self-preparation or financial ability or what have you,
Yeah.
freedom, be able to respond and rebuild their lives after an earthquake. So, and of course, these are huge generalizations, and the
But
authors
broad
acknowledge that.
cultural trends
Yeah,
that you
absolutely.
find.
So I think culture makes a difference, but I really do think the economics of it make a huge difference. I mean, if somebody, and then this goes into the current question about how much housing costs. So the difference of whether you own a small house that you might be able to do some repairs on yourself by spending a few $1,000s in a trip to the DIY store versus if you're barely affording rent. That's a significant difference in two scenarios, and that would likely affect a person's attitude about how much they can or can't do ahead of time and whether they should worry or not.
We'll be back with more of the episode in just a moment. But before that, if you're watching on YouTube, please click like and subscribe. And if you're watching from Optic TV, follow us on YouTube. It's Island Sound and Story.
And you've written a book recently about housing, especially in BC. And are there conflicting incentives here in some cases, both in terms of, well, some buildings need to be taken down or changed to have the same amount of units, say, as they currently have, but, we want to be adding units to try and relieve some of these pressures. Or in another form, you talk about, a renter, potentially the excuse of, oh, this unit's not sound, it needs upgrades, they'll be expensive, could be a proxy by which a landlord could kick them out. So they may be less likely to push those concerns. What are some of these either conflicting or friction producing different incentives or factors that you see out there in terms of seismic upgrades and preemptiveness versus other concerns?
It's kind of a humbling point for me, having written a book on what I think is the need to do more to get ready for natural disasters, earthquakes in particular, and also then onto this latest book, which is that we need to do an awful lot more as a society to have stable, affordable housing, because in a lot of ways they actually work against each other. I'm not saying they have to, that you can't have one, you have to choose, because I think that's a false dichotomy, but they absolutely can work against each other. I mean, most seismic provisions that are added to the building codes, at least you talk to most engineers and builders I've talked to, they make housing more expensive. And housing's already expensive enough. And I've talked to a number of engineers who say there's a huge debate about how safe do we need to make a building? And I don't know if there's an absolute obvious question, because you could make the building code so onerous that it wouldn't even, that it would basically suffer next to no damage in the world's most damaging earthquake. But what if it costs 3 times as much to do that as a building that has been made safe enough that it won't collapse and kill people, but it would likely have to be torn down afterwards? Like, that's a key question. Should the building code require buildings to simply not kill people, or should it require them to be so robust that they're usable afterwards? I mean, obviously you'd want that in a hospital, because it's going to be treating a lot of injured people. And I would argue you want that in a school, because they can often be emergency centers, shelters, and so on. But does every single house, I don't think there's a simple answer to that, but the building code is becoming more and more robust. And as a result, it's becoming more expensive and time consuming to build new construction. So that's a difficult one to answer. I will say, though, I think it's made all the more difficult the worse the housing crisis gets. So in other words, the longer we let it go, where we're not building enough housing for it to be affordable or attainable for most people, then the more difficult every little fix gets. Like, I cycle back and forth to work every day, and over the last year and a half, I've watched a very affordable, I think it was a 1970s 3-story apartment building rental get torn down and made way for a brand new 6-story market rental apartment building. And you can see one of the inherent dilemmas in the housing crisis right there. This private company that bought it, they have displaced a number of people who are living there at affordable rents. And that's not good. I mean, it just isn't. We hear frequently from people of all ages who have affordable rentals, and then they get rent-evicted or evicted, and they can't afford new market rents. And yet at the same point, this company has more than doubled the units of available, roughly middle-class apartments in the city, in an inner city neighborhood. So in that sense, it's good. But every time you make a change, there's good and bad. So,
Yeah.
and I think it's the same with preparation for emergency seismic retrofits and so on as well.
Yeah. Well, I won't keep you too long here, but I've noticed in the past few years we've had some updates on that front. We've had construction and creation proceed for kind of a central, I think it's a command center type of thing for the coordinated local response in the South Island region. We've had a tower of sorts go up in Tofino,
Mhm.
where there was risk if people were out on the beach, they would not have a close enough place to evacuate to. Um, we've seen, I think, improved flood mapping on the island. A lot of the flood maps were out of date, and I believe those are being updated. What have you seen since you wrote the book? And do you think things are going in the right direction? And are they going there fast enough?
That last one's a tough one, but I definitely think they're going in the right direction. I mean, you pointed out a number of key improvements. There's also the advance of the earthquake early warning system that Natural Resources Canada has worked on, and that's the kind of thing where we could get a ping on our phone, and even if it's just 10 seconds, if it gets us to dive under a sturdy table or desk, it could mean the difference between a head injury or not. It could also mean the difference in gas pipelines, that are automatically shut down, or in high rises where the warning goes out and it's enough to bring the elevators immediately down, or all sorts of things, or SkyTrain in Metro Vancouver, or tunnels that have gates that can close and stop the flow of traffic into them beforehand. So earthquake early warning is one of them. A lot more schools. I ride on my bike commute past Vic High as well. That's just open to students. That's hundreds more students that are now in a much safer seismic environment. And I see it happening all the time. So yeah, definitely we're headed in the right direction. Whether we're going fast enough, I don't know. I mean, ultimately, I'm sorry if this sounds like a cop-out, but the truth is we won't really know until the next big one hits.
Until we know, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, we won't know if we're early enough until it's
Yeah.
too late.
Yeah,
in a
so we may
sense.
not be, but I just don't know yet. And practically speaking, I think we're doing a lot. Could we go faster? Yes, but at least we're going. That's what I'm happy to see.
And you've talked just there about there are, in some cases, small differences or small advantages that can produce big results. Can you speak quickly, both in these potential disasters and in other ones that you touch on in the book, the Mount St. Helens and the California quake, quakes on the East Coast, etc. Can you talk just briefly about what kind of swing factors there are, or what kind of differences we see from whether it's a specific change or a small change? What can make these drastic swings in terms of survival, in terms of infrastructure retention, in terms of what things look like afterward during the days and weeks and months that people have to recover and get back to a semblance of life?
I think one of the things that can, I'll give you a small example. There is, you can get seismometers, and there's a pilot project in Greater Victoria to put these basically earthquake meters in houses and public buildings all over a city like Victoria. And it's, at first I didn't see the appeal or the advantage of this, because all it would do is, say if there was one in the basement here, it would tell us how much physical force this building suffered. And I thought, what's the point of that? Because we can see the building's damaged. But the thing is, if you have a city that has thousands of buildings with cracks in it, you actually don't know how damaged they are, and you don't know if it's safe to go in. So something like having these, they will allow engineers and building inspectors to much more quickly be able to say that building is too risky. Whereas that one, it actually hardly got any shaking. It can change from block to block if a building's on bedrock versus clay. So having a network of little, very simple technology accelerometers in basements all over the city, public and private, that could really help us move back into buildings rather than being stuck in tents or shipping containers for months or even years. So a simple change like that. Also, as I mentioned, schools can play a pivotal role. Obviously, we don't want them to collapse on children and students in an earthquake. But if you make a school so robust that it could be a shelter for hundreds of residents displaced, or a command center, or whatever, that could be the kind of investment that pays dividends multiple times over. And I think finally, attitudes. I mean, since writing the book, a couple of my neighbors wrote it, and they got way ahead of me in getting prepared. And they said, we want to be prepared. And they've established an annual block party where we just have a barbecue once a year. They close down the street, but we get to know each other better. We talk about who's got emergency supplies. Some of the neighbors are strengthening the basements of their homes. And again, this goes to ownership versus rentals, but just being prepared and making social connections and that kind of thing, and keeping food on standby, and knowing who's a vulnerable person on the block can make your whole community safer, even if a few people on every block start to think that way, whereas they didn't beforehand. So there's a lot, and I like your question of what relatively simple or one-dimensional changes can kind of expand out and be really beneficial elsewhere.
Yeah, and a lot of those things like community building are things that will have other benefits too.
Absolutely.
Just before I let you go, what changes have you ended up making either before or immediately after you ended up completing the book?
Well, my biggest change is the one that in some ways reflects the complacency of people and their busy lives and so on. I started, but I'm still in the process of fixing the basement walls of my house. So I'm about halfway done, but I had hoped to be done. I'm a bit like the personification of the BC school program. They were supposed to be done years ago. I was hoping to be done about 1 year ago, maybe 2 years ago, and I'm still halfway done. And, every time I think, okay, I'm going to replace these old boards nailed to the 2x4 wall studs with thick 3/4-inch plywood, something comes up, the dog needs a walk, or I've got kids' sports to take it to, or I'm tired, or I could come up with a lot more excuses.
Of course.
I don't get there. So that's getting there, and again, hopefully it'll be done in the next year or two. And if that's done, my house will be much less likely to collapse in an earthquake. So if I get it done in time, that will have been a big improvement. Also, just readiness of supplies and so on. But I think in a lot of ways, even knowing as much as I do, I still am like a lot of people that when something isn't breathing down your neck, it's easy to put off things that you should really get done right away.
Well, I hope you get it done in time and that you don't need to have it done in
Me
time.
too, for all of us.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for appearing on the program and taking the time today.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Next, I talked to Cormac O'Brien, who, in his day-to-day life, never really thought about the big one. But one night changed that all.
There's a lot of preparation that goes into the so-called big one, which is obviously either a tsunami or earthquake that's going to rock Vancouver Island. At least people think so. And you have a specific experience with this. Can you tell me about that?
It was always talked about. I'm not from the West Coast. I'm from England. My parents moved to Vancouver Island when I was about 6 or 7. So we were sort of like late to the big one, as it were. We weren't shaped. I mean, I was raised, I guess, with it all around me, but it was like a new phenomenon when I learned about it. And it was definitely, I remember my parents would often say like, well, if we'd known, we would have rethought coming out here. And they really took it quite seriously, and they were really, I think, scared by it because, again, especially for them, when I was 6 or 7 or 8, I maybe didn't realize how serious it could be. But for them, they were really aware, like, oh, okay, this is like, no one told us about this, but yet everybody in Victoria knows about it. Everyone in Victoria tells us and talks about it constantly. So I would always had that in the back of my head, and then when I started living by myself, I was working as a journalist. Mostly for the University of Victoria student newspaper, the Martlet. And so I was reporting quite a lot on disasters and emergency preparedness, mostly because UVic does a lot of that stuff. So I remember, I would write articles about, they would bring an earthquake simulator to campus and I'd write about that. And so always kind of vaguely aware of it. But as someone living by myself, sort of my own, the most I thought about it was every like 6 months or so, you'd go, oh, I really should have an emergency kit. And I never did. I never actually got one, but I always thought I should have one of those. And then one morning, and I mean morning, it was like, I think about 1:30 a.m. in the morning, my brother, who I was living with, we were both in a basement apartment in Fernwood. And my brother came into my room and said, hey, I think something's going on. And I was quite groggy, I would imagine. I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, I was just online, and there's been a tsunami alert sent for Victoria." And those happen every once in a while. It didn't seem or it wasn't maybe immediately that serious, but the way my brother was talking about it, and quickly after looking it up, it felt different. It felt like a much more serious one. And I think you have to maybe correct me. It was 7.1 or 7.2 earthquake off the coast of Alaska.
Yeah, it was a 7.9
A
actually.
7.9. So he told so my brother tells me there's been a 7.9 earthquake off the coast of Alaska, and there's a warning in place now for all of Vancouver Island. And I think, for better or for worse, whether this actually has any sort of grounding in geological science, when you hear about the earthquakes in Japan, or it feels a bit different than one in Alaska. It just feels like, wow, that's closer. It must mean that it's probably going to be more serious for us. And so, we lived in Fernwood, which is not by the water, and it's not on the west side of Vancouver Island, which I think would have made us a little bit more susceptible to being caught by any tsunami that happened. But my brother was really worried about it, and he said, "What do we do?" And I said, "Well, I don't really know if there's much we can do. This is it. He said, "No, we should go somewhere high." And so I said, "Okay, well, if you're worried about it, let's get to Mount Tomey. That seems like probably the best place we could go." And so Mount Doug, I think, would have just been too busy, maybe, was the assumption. We thought everybody's going to go to Mount Doug. We'll go to Mount Tomey. It'd be a bit quieter. And so we genuinely, and I really, really remember this, I left thinking, this is going to be chaos. This is going to be mayhem. Everyone's going to have seen this alert. Everyone's going to be going to the top of the mountains. And so I thought, we better get there quick. If we're going to do it, let's get there quick. And so I grabbed a few things, jumped in our car and booked it up to Mount Tomey. And then quickly realized when we got to the top of Mount Tomey that no one else had really taken this as seriously as we had. There weren't a lot of people up there. That being said, a few people did, over the next 20, 30 minutes, people did start sort of coming in. And it was quite funny to see, who it is who decides, hey, no, we're going to take this seriously. And there wasn't a lot of chat. It was, 2 a.m., I think, at this point. So people were still pretty groggy. But there was definitely, I remember, people would come up, park, maybe check it out a little bit, go back, come back with some Tim Hortons, and would just sort of get in the lay of the land, engaging things. I took it upon myself to look up, okay, well, maybe there's some news about this online. Obviously, the alert's been issued. What else is there? No one had written anything. And so I was working for the Martlet at the time. I thought, wow, this is a pretty good opportunity. And so I posted a quick story, just like a headline, one line, hey, emergency alert issued. Here's what we know so far. And I believe I updated it over the next 5, 6, 7 hours, and I think it was the best read article I'd ever written for the Martlet. Like, it really, people were clearly like, I think obviously by virtue of just being first, but also the topic. I mean, this is, as soon as you wake up and as soon as you see that news that an earthquake's hit and that there are potential ramifications for Vancouver Island, that your mind goes to one place, and that is, okay, this is it. This is the big one. This is what we've been waiting for. And so I think that resonated with people in terms of reading the article. As it stands, I think Vincent and I waited there for maybe 3 or 4 hours, and then I think it started coming in that, okay, you know what, this isn't the big one. This isn't. I think Tofino ended up with an alert, but I think once the alert was cleared for the rest of Vancouver Island, we thought, okay, we think we're pretty safe here, and we headed back home. And everyone we told, like, it was a pretty fun story to tell people that we were the first ones up on Mount Tomey. But everyone we told was pretty much like, you'd be okay in Fernwood too, right? Well, yeah, we didn't know that. We didn't know what was going to happen. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was around 4:30 a.m. that it got downgraded. I find it so funny that that people, it was your best read article, so people were willing to read about it, but weren't willing to go to the top of the mountain to possibly avoid it.
Yeah, I don't know what I said in that article that let people think that, like, oh, maybe it's okay. Like, I definitely wasn't, opining on what would happen. I definitely was just reporting what was there. But yeah, I think it's a lot of, like, people wake up, they see the alert, they Google it, they check the phone. Okay, I'm gonna go back to bed. It's probably okay.
Yeah. I have a lot of conversations with my partner, like, oh, we should really put a plan out, but we just don't get around to it because, regular life gets to you. But there's always this, like, looming cloud. Did you think about it much? Like, your parents were super aware of it, but what about yourself?
Well, my parents, they moved away from Vancouver Island. They moved to the East Coast, and they definitely, we would have maybe made fun of them for saying so, but they definitely said at the time, like, we really just never felt comfortable. We never really felt like we could really ever settle here because this thing was looming over us. I didn't feel that way. I never felt like, oh, I like that it realistically, I just never thought it would happen. It was always a talking point. I mean, as you live there, like I'd say you end up talking about the big one like once every 3 or 4 months with someone, just randomly, it'll come up or whatever. It never weighed on me. I never thought like, other than again, these passing moments where you're like, I should probably have a plan in place for something that just in case, and you never end up doing it. That being said, now that I live away from Vancouver Island, now that I live in Ontario, I think I'd really have to seriously consider it if I wanted to move back. I think I kind of feel like I got away with it a little bit by living there and not having it happen and not having to really think about it or prep for it. But if I moved back now, I definitely would. I definitely would. It would factor in. I mean, that being said, I mean, Toronto has just itself gone through a couple weeks of like emergency flooding and the infrastructure clearly not being able to handle what's happened. So I think it's top of mind anyway. But particularly in Victoria, the fact it's an island, and the fact that it's been, statistically, it's got to happen at some point. But
yeah.
So yeah, it didn't weigh on me while I lived there. But now that I'm away, and when I think back on it, I'm surprised it didn't more.
Yeah, and part of that we have to think about too is just the increase in extreme weather events generally due to climate change, right?
There's two ways to look at it. I think one is that, well, this was already supposed to be sort of apocalyptic. This was already supposed to be apocalyptic. And so realistically, just due to the way weather patterns are going, it'll probably be worse than it could have been because of the way the world is going. Or, well, it doesn't matter where you are in Canada. Apocalyptic stuff is happening anyway. You may as well go live in Victoria.
You might as well go on the beach.
Yeah, why not? Whatever. There's Toronto's going to have its own big one, I'm sure, in 5 years or 6 months or whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Or maybe we'll all go to Regina because that's going to be the new beachfront property.
Exactly.
Speaking to your experience of being on Mount Ptolemy, who were the types of people that were there? Because I have an image in my mind of like two people, which is me and you who rarely talks about the big one, but maybe every now and then. But then I have this image of a person who's like a doomsday but earthquake prepper who's like got everything laid out. Like, who are the people at the top of that mountain?
I don't think there were any doomsday preppers there, and that's because ultimately, if you were a doomsday prepper, you would have prepared better than to just go to the top of Mount Ptolemy at 2 a.m. You know what I mean? The people that had showed up to Mount Ptolemy at 2 a.m. were the people who all of a sudden realized they'd never thought seriously enough about it and now have to sort of improvise. And so I don't quite remember sort of who exactly it would have been. I just remember it being a lot of like, I mean, it was all people with cars, obviously, people who'd driven up. So mostly older folks, maybe 30s, 40s, people who were just like, I think just happy to go sit at the top of the hill, drink a coffee and just sort of wait and see what was going to happen. So quite like, it wasn't like a party atmosphere. It was definitely people who were happy to keep to themselves and just sit in their cars and wait. But yeah, I think obviously, not that I really could diagnose at that point, but definitely people with some sense of anxiety about what was going on around them. Although that, again, I mean, that's a pretty general feeling these days. So
obviously this event ended up, being a nothing burger in some sense, but it probably gave you some perspective. And you're probably lucky for that. Whereas, people in Jasper who might have heard about the wildfire aren't as lucky. There's a bad outcome in that. Did that shift your perspective afterwards? Did you kind of think about things a little bit more, and were you a little bit more aware? And is this why you moved to Toronto?
It wasn't quite why I moved to Toronto. I moved to Toronto for the much cheaper rent. The clever thing to do would have been to go out that day and buy an emergency kit. And I never did. For as long as I lived in Victoria, I never did. So I think it speaks a little bit to arrogance and a little bit to like, oh, well, this was as close as I thought it was going to get, and it didn't even happen. What have I got to worry about? This is never going to happen. Versus like a wake-up call of like, oh, this really could happen at any minute. That's probably the takeaway I should have had, and I didn't. But I think a lot of people feel that way. I think a lot of people, like if everybody felt the way they should have felt, they all would have gone out and buy emergency kits. And no, that didn't happen, obviously. No, not probably a few people did, and they're the clever ones. But it's these close calls, at least personally for me, even like, for instance, the ones in Toronto we've had, not that they've been close calls, but these moments where you realize the sort of the veneer of infrastructure is that it's a veneer. There's actually, like, if it rains too much, you're screwed. That's it. There's no real way around it. When that happens, it's, I don't know, it's almost like seeing what's on the other side is so terrifying that once you don't have to think about it anymore, you just stop and you're like, phew, great, I don't have to worry about that anymore. It came close to happening and it was pretty scary while it was happening, but as soon as it's done, you're like, well, I never want to have to think about that again.
From the outside looking in, would you have any advice for people like me who in the middle of cheersing a beer go, oh yeah, there might be an earthquake, and then go on living my life?
I don't think it helps to live in the perpetual fear of what might happen. That being said, there's some like really cool emergency preparedness kits out there for like $50. And I know, like, I'm still within myself, I still don't own one. And this is probably going to be the thing that does it for me. I feel like I can't talk this much about them and not go get one. So I'm sure I will. But that's like a really lovely bit of peace of mind, and I feel like for those moments when when you are confronted with it, and those moments you have to think about it, I feel like just having something there. Not everyone can hop in a car and get out to Mount Solomon at 2 a.m. in the morning. Not everyone has someone who would text them and be like, hey, this is happening. You've got to make sure you're okay. Having some sort of self-reliance, some form of self-reliance when it seems like the governments and the infrastructure that we've all relied on, and when it feels like that's actually not as capable as we thought it once was. I think just having something that you can grab a hold of in that, I feel like is worth its weight in gold for sure.
Yeah. That's good advice. Yeah, watch a bunch of Bear Grylls, I guess. And
I mean, it probably wouldn't hurt, would it?
yeah.
I don't know how much I don't know how much good sort of like those nature preparedness shows would do you when the island splits in half. But hey, better to watch it than not.
Yeah. Love Island's one of them, right?
That's for when the society rebuilds itself. That's what that's for. Yeah.
That's the image we rebuilt it in.
Today's episode was powered by TELUS STORYHIVE, and it was hosted and produced by Ryan Huck and Cam Welch. Additional technical production from Eric Hinch at House of Owl. Thanks so much, and till next time.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.